The fact that there's no biology department anywhere in my country or yours that stood up to the claims of gender ideology and said the obvious truth, which is there are people who have persistent gender dysphoria. That's presumably not their fault. We're sympathetic to them. However, there are two and only two sexes. That has nothing to do with human dynamics. It's a feature of our lineage that goes back long before we were humans. It goes back hundreds of millions of years, in fact. And you cannot change sexes by declaring that you've done so. Every biology department should have said that. Even if most biology departments were confused, there should have been a diversity of opinion. What we got instead was no diversity of opinion whatsoever. We got biology departments playing along with a fiction. And worse, there's no medical school that stood up and said the equivalent. In fact, medical schools have participated in the mutilation of healthy young people, and there was not an uprising. So we can see that our formal education system is not working. This is not the only example, but it's probably the clearest one because we do have 100 or several 100 million years of history to test our modern sensibilities against. So that overthrow has resulted in our derailing the primary capacity for a civilization to figure out what is true and proceed from it. And that's a terrifying place to be.
Yeah, so I think the essay by Helen Andrews, The Great Feminization, touched on this really well. Have you read that at all? Were you familiar?
It does not ring a bell.
It's really good. It was released on Compact, but what she pointed out was, as you were discussing, as certain institutions passed that 50 to 50 threshold, then they took on the feminine group dynamic, which she puts very well as the difference between it is the more masculine ethos is mission oriented, focused on succeeding with whatever goal is set. Whereas the more feminine ethos is making sure that everyone is playing the game. And then, so you see this play out where now the point of science isn't to discover the truth, it's to make sure everyone is included in the scientific process. Or you see the same thing happen across many other forms, whether it be media, the judicial, the law sectors, and so on. That that dynamic, as you're talking about, is playing out more and more. And then, you see these institutions kind of lose their primary purpose and they stop existing for the reason that they do. Now, she argued that a lot of this wasn't organic, but rather the result of affirmative action policies and companies being afraid of lawsuits for not having gender parity within, especially the higher levels. But I guess back to you on that, would you see this being a organic outgrowth of the feminist movement, or is it something that we've engineered and manufactured?
Well, I'm not sure I necessarily recognize that distinction. I think humans alter their way of functioning and interacting as a natural part of the evolutionary process. And I don't know that feminism in its original form wasn't an appropriate unfolding of that evolutionary process. But I would point out that there is a distinction between the initial objectives of first wave feminism, which was access, to the nth wave feminism that we are now seeing, where there is an attempt to effectively bully culture into accepting certain things, whether they are linguistic rules or beliefs about the universe, irrespective of the evidence or the consequences of believing them. And one other dynamic that I think belongs on the table here is we have something like a cognitive epidemic where we have understood the universe first in the places where the universe is simple and fundamental. So in the land of science, I would say we have understood physics and chemistry early, and we are late to understand biology because biology is truly complex, not just complicated. So what we have is a lot of people who are expert in complicated things, who look at biology and assume it's more of the same, and they miss the most fundamental fact about biology. Because biology is a fundamentally complex realm, it is also unpredictable, which means you can have what sounds like a very rational idea about how to change parameter X in order to alter some result Y, but you have to check whether or not that's what happened, and you have to look at what the unintended consequences of that alteration are. And very often we have ideas that are lovely, like affirmative action. I used to support affirmative action. Sounds like a very good idea. We have people who are obviously unjustly excluded from things, a temporary fix in which we forcibly include them so that we can get to parity or whatever objective we're looking for and move forward from there. That sounds like a great idea. Unfortunately, it had many negative consequences that we pretended were not there so that we could continue on, and it effectively became a permanent system, which it was not intended to be at first. So I think we need to recognize that whatever the objectives were, we have a civilization that does not accomplish most of the things that it used to accomplish. And it didn't have to be this way. If the idea was that women should be included across the board in whatever activities in civilization they want to be included in, with very few exceptions, that could have been made to happen without destroying the culture that was already functioning in those places. That's what we should have done. And having not done that, we should have noticed, oh goodness, all sorts of things that we're working aren't working anymore. Where did we make our error? Gone back and changed it. We didn't do that. And now, unfortunately, the beauty of culture is that it can change rapidly. The downside of culture is that functional culture can be lost in a single generation. So now, not only is there a disruption of all of the realms that functioned according to what looked like male rules before, but the people who know how they are supposed to run are largely already gone, right? There's not enough memory of the proper functioning of science within the academy to reboot it. Even if we started today, it would take us 3 generations, in my opinion, to get to a place where there were enough people who knew how to do science properly to make the thing work. That's a truly frightening problem.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, when you put it like that, it's a little dark. From my side, it's unique. I'm similar to you. I've been with my wife for 20 years. We met when she was 18, I was 20, almost 21. So what she was is sort of a first wave feminist. And she's come to rather dislike where the current market is at. And she actually made a really good point, and I'd kind of bring up is, she basically said, when you're looking at the combination of genders, it's kind of a yin and yang. You actually need balance. You don't need equality, because if you push for equality, you can't have freedom. So, and that's when you kind of look at it from a political perspective. And I think the same applies here. If you push for equality, well, you've kind of got this system where a high volume number of females are trying to enter these male spaces, which again, they're more than welcome to, but they're overthrowing it with more feminine strategy, feminine ideology. And like you said, it's breaking the system. But really, you're looking for equality, but then you're throwing everything out of balance. And if you don't find balance in the system between men and women, male, female, it will always be broken. You can have something off kilter and equality, and it still kind of functions okay. But when something's out of balance, it falls over, quite simply. And I agree with you. When you look at the entire system of science, as you've explained, it's upside down. So I have this question then. I'm of the same opinion when listening to you that this is going to be driven by correcting course from a scientific educational perspective in a big way. Sure, political as well, but really science. You think we're 3 generations away from correcting course. I'm an eternal optimist. How do we move in the right direction here? What do we actually do, and what does success look like?
Well, a couple things. We're 3 generations, in my opinion, away from a system that functions anything like the one that we broke. We're not 3 generations away from things getting better.
Right.
Things could start getting better right away. I don't expect them to, but they could. 2 other points, though. Heather describes her own trajectory. She says that she grew up at the best moment to be a woman. And the reason she says that is because at the point, so we grew up more or less in the 70s and 80s. At that moment, it became possible for women to do just about anything that they wanted to. And that obviously is a major advantage. But there were not yet the assumptions and suppositions about how to do those things. In other words, these were women entering, I don't want to describe it in more perfect terms than it deserves, but more or less a meritocratic world where women could enter those realms, but they had to prove themselves. That has broken down. Heather now says she's concerned that having been a tomboy, she would have been pushed in the direction of trans ideology, which is a horrifying thought to her, to me, and it should be to everyone. So there's that. I also think yin yang is the right way to think about this. And I find it interesting that we have to borrow from the Far East in order to find that description. We do not in the West have a close relationship with that kind of symmetry. But what I want to point out about it is not unequal. It is a complementarity, but if you look at that symbol, it is perfectly equal without being symmetrical in any of the traditional ways. It is a complex symmetry. So that is what we're shooting for, at least with respect to the relationship between men and women. Now, I don't really want to see that dynamic in something as important as science. In other words, science will be over on one side of the yin-yang in terms of how it functions. I'm perfectly happy for anybody who wants to join it to do so if they have the skills. But it will be of that dynamic, just as we don't expect women playing basketball to play so according to rules about everybody being included. Basketball is competitive. The women should play like the men because that's the nature of basketball. But in any case, I would point both young men and women to the examples that they have in front of them of people who have navigated the yin-yang, of institutions that have retained some of this culture, of which we have very few. So it's not an easy challenge, but I would say what you want to find are those few things that indicate what road we failed to take so that we can move all of those disrupted activities back on track.